Chapter 15. Progressive Montana, 1900 to 1924. The big picture. Industrialization gave big companies control over life and politics in many ways. During the Progressive era, people worked together to limit the control corporations had and to solve problems in their society. If you could change society for the better, what would you want to change? How would you go about working for that change? At the dawn of the 20th century, people across the country saw many problems in their society. They saw poverty and disease. They saw people working in unsafe conditions just to make a living. They saw families crowded in slums with bad water, rats, bugs, and other threats to public health. They also saw political and economic power concentrated in the hands of a very few wealthy men. They realized these problems dragged all of society down. They wanted healthier cities and safer working conditions. They believed that America's democracy would work better if citizens had more political power. So they worked for political, social, and economic change. This period became known as the Progressive Era. Progressivism started at the local level as people organized to work for change. They got involved with their church groups, civic clubs, labor unions,
organizations of employees that bargain with employers,
and women's clubs. They wrote letters, gave talks, and led marches to publicize their ideas. They raised money to build libraries and city parks. They helped pass new laws to protect workers' safety and public health. Nationally, the Progressive Era did not last long, from about 1900 until 1917, when the U.S. joined World War I. In Montana, it lasted longer until the mid-1920s and had a profound
and important
effect on everyday life. Though some progressive movements failed, others became so important that it is hard to imagine life without them. America transformed. To many people, the dawn of the 20th century felt like a new era. Their lives were changing fast. Industrialization,
rapid development of industry brought about by the introduction of machinery,
had swept across North America in the late 1800s. It brought new conveniences like electric lights and labor-saving devices like washing machines and typewriters. Many people felt hopeful and excited. New technologies like X-rays and electric batteries improved people's lives. New scientific discoveries like Einstein's theory of relativity and the discovery of the atom led many people to believe that the world was understandable. They also thought that experts could apply science and technology to solve social problems. Problems of the Industrial Revolution. Yet, industrialization had a dark side. The factories that produced modern conveniences relied on an almost endless supply of cheap labor. In the eastern U.S., men, women, and children labored 14-hour days operating dangerous machines in unheated workrooms. In Montana, workers toiled in mines, smelters, and timber camps to provide the raw materials eastern factories needed to operate. Their jobs were dangerous, too, and many people were injured or killed in industrial accidents. Many of these workers were immigrants. Between 1900 and 1915, about 15 million immigrants arrived in the U.S., more than all of the immigrants in the previous 40 years. Millions of these new immigrants came from non-English speaking countries. Their customs, traditions, and religions were different from mainstream
majority
Americas. Even though most people's families had immigrated to the United States only a few generations earlier, many Americans worried about how these newcomers would change the country. Cities swelled with slums where the workers lived. Families crowded together in apartments. Children played in streets and alleyways and were constantly exposed to health hazards. Factories spit
out
smoke, soot, and other pollutants into the air and the rivers. In Montana, pollution from smelters killed off wildlife, livestock, trees, and crops for miles around the smelters, and made many people sick. Meanwhile, a few men grew very rich, and the corporations they owned grew large and powerful. Montana, under the thumb of the company. By 1900, many Montanans lived in the grip of a few large copper, lumber, and railroad corporations, all run by a handful of men.
See Chapter 10.
The most powerful was the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, known by everyone as simply the company, with interests in railroads, lumber, and electric power. Anaconda wielded almost total control over Montana. It employed a large number of people. It manipulated,
controlled in a devious way,
many of the state's businesses, as well as the Montana legislature,
the branch of government that passes laws.
It also owned most of the state's newspapers, so it controlled public opinion. Political reforms, power to the people. Progressives believed that corporations like the Anaconda Copper Mining Company had too much control over government, and that ordinary people did not have enough. So they pushed for political reforms to give voters more political power. Because of these reforms, you will have a stronger voice in government than your ancestors had in 1900. The Initiative. Passed in 1906, the Initiative allows voters to establish and pass laws they want, even if the legislature refuses to pass them. If citizens collect a certain number of signatures, an initiative can be put on the general ballot for people to vote on. The Referendum. The referendum, also passed in 1906, works the same way as the initiative, but allows voters to repeal,
cancel,
laws passed by the legislature that the people do not want. Direct election of senators. In the 19th century, the legislatures, not the people, elected U.S. senators. Copper King William A. Clark caused a nationwide outrage when he bribed,
offered illegal payments to
legislators to elect him to the U.S. Senate.
See Chapter 10.
In 1911, the Montana legislature passed a law allowing Montanans to choose their own senators. In 1912, the U.S. Congress passed the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, giving voters nationwide the right to elect U.S. senators. Primary elections. Powerful corporate owners often controlled political parties. In Montana, the company decided who could run for public office. Progressives wanted to give voters more say in who the candidates would be. So they proposed an initiative in 1912 to institute primary elections. Primary elections let voters choose the candidates to run in the general election. 1914. Women get the vote. Many homesteaders and immigrants who came to Montana after 1900 believed that women were more virtuous,
morally good,
than men. They thought that if women could vote, they would use their moral superiority to end political corruption and improve society. That is why many progressives supported women's suffrage, which is the right to vote. A young Missoula woman named Jeanette Rankin led the charge for women's suffrage in Montana. Rankin traveled to almost every corner of the state, speaking at rallies, holding meetings, and talking to newspaper editors, trying to convince them to support women's suffrage. In 1911, Rankin gave a speech to legislators in the Montana House of Representatives, where no woman had been allowed to speak before. Other Montana women who fought for suffrage sat beside her: Mary Long Alderson, Dr. Maria Dean, and Dr. Mary Moore Atwater. When she finished talking, the legislators gave her a standing ovation. Finally, in 1914, Montana's male voters amended the state constitution,
a document that sets rules for government,
to give women the vote. 6 years later, in 1920, U.S. voters gave all women in the country the right to vote. 1916. First women in Congress. In 1916, Montanans elected Jeanette Rankin to Congress and became the first state to send a woman to Washington, D.C. People watched her closely to see whether a woman could hold her own in national politics. Rankin quickly proved that she could. In fact, she immediately made a big stir by speaking out against World War I.
See Chapter 16.
The 1916 election also put two women in the Montana legislature: Maggie Smith Hathaway, a Democrat from Raleigh County, and Emma J. Ingalls, a Republican newspaper publisher from Flathead County. By 1920, Hathaway had become a powerful leader in state politics. County busting for better citizenship. One progressive idea changed the map of Montana by splitting big eastern counties into smaller ones. As the homesteaders peopled more of Montana, they wanted to be more involved in local politics, so they wanted their county seats closer. And the eastern farmers knew that having more smaller counties would give them a stronger vote in the state legislature, because each county had one state senator. This changed in the 1960s. In 1915, The Montana legislature passed a law allowing people to redraw their county lines by submitting a petition to the state. In the next few years, Montana's 27 counties split into 56 smaller counties. Splitting up counties was called county busting. Many small counties in eastern Montana struggle today with the after effects of the Progressive-era county busting craze. Of the 56 counties in the state, 22 have fewer than 5,000 people. 13 counties have fewer than 2,000 people. Petroleum County has only 474. Nearly every legislature since 1936 has considered consolidating,
combining several into one,
some of these counties, but these measures have failed because citizens want to keep their county seats. Labor reform. Workers unite for better conditions. Montana's mines, lumber mills, and railroads all ran on the labor of working people. Working men prided themselves on the skill they brought to dangerous, difficult work. Yet as demand for Montana's resources intensified, the pace of production quickened. Industrial work became even more dangerous. The mines and sawmills hired more unskilled laborers. Many of them were immigrants who spoke little English. They did not understand the instructions or warnings that more experienced workers gave them. New mining methods using dynamite, machine drills, and steam-powered hoists,
devices for lifting,
increased productivity. But they also made accidents more frequent and more deadly. By 1908, mining had the highest fatality rate of any industry in the nation. Mining, railroad work, and logging were all more likely to kill a man than going to war. If laborers could not work, their families went hungry. If they spoke out against their working conditions, they got fired. There were always plenty of other men looking for a job. If they went on strike,
an organized protest in which workers refused to work,
or protested, the company simply had the governor call in armed troops. In the height of the Progressive era, labor unions and progressive politicians worked together to improve workplace safety. They backed laws establishing the minimum wage, the 8-hour workday, and a workers' compensation program to give aid to workers injured on the job. Farmers organized, too. In eastern Montana, farmers also called for reforms. Farmers paid high transportation prices to ship their products to market, while mines and lumber mills, which had close ties to the railroads, shipped their products at discount rates. Some farmers formed local cooperatives to market produce,
farm products,
and to negotiate lower rail rates. They demanded that the state regulate railroads in Montana to make sure rates were fair and honest. In 1907, the state legislature created a Montana Railroad Commission, which in 1913 became the Montana Public Service Commission. This commission oversees all public transportation carriers and the electrical utilities to make sure consumers are treated fairly. Social reforms, efforts to improve society. Disease, diarrhea, and infection were part of everyday life in the early 1900s. People lived and worked close together with inadequate sewers and polluted drinking water. Industries polluted the water and air, but towns caused pollution too. Many towns dumped their garbage at the city's edge, where flies picked up germs and spread them. People emptied spittoons, which are containers for spitting tobacco, garbage, kitchen slop, and chamber pots into rivers or in a hole in the ground. Horses and mules that worked in the towns and mines created tremendous amounts of manure. Without proper sanitation, diseases spread rapidly. Smallpox, cholera, diphtheria, typhoid, and tuberculosis killed many people. In 1907, the Montana legislature made it illegal for cities to dump raw sewage into rivers that people used for drinking water. The law was one of the first Clean Water Acts passed in the country. Progressives also helped create a state board of health. They thought experts could apply scientific principles to reduce the spread of diseases. They established a state hospital to treat tuberculosis patients. They also got the state to set up agencies to inspect milk and meat products to make sure that the food people bought was safe. Reducing child labor. Imagine waking up every morning at dawn and running down to the mine for a 12-hour workday picking coal, mucking,
cleaning
stables, or cleaning tools. Your lungs fill with mine dust. You must constantly watch out for heavy, dangerous equipment. You work hard, because your widowed mother relies on your income to survive. You earn $1 a day. Industrial accidents left many women widows, and children often had to leave school to help support their families. Young boys worked as nippers, which were errand boys who fetched tools, tended mules, and did other odd jobs for the mines. They also worked as newsboys, chimney sweeps, carpenters' helpers, messengers, shoe shiners, and peddlers.
People who sell things door to door.
Girls often worked as servants for wealthy families. In 1904, Montana voters passed a constitutional amendment,
A change to the Constitution.
setting age 16 as the minimum age for employment in the mines, and age 14 for other jobs. Farm and ranch children worked hard too, tending animals, operating farm equipment, chopping firewood, and fetching water. But because so many homesteaders relied on the labor of their children, the child labor laws did not apply to farms. A few years later, the legislature passed a law requiring children to attend school until age 16. Together, these two laws helped make sure that Montana's youth had an opportunity for a healthy childhood and a basic education. A special court for kids. In 1903, a 14-year-old boy named Harry Anderson burned down the Montana Club, a prominent Helena building. Harry liked to set fires, ring the fire alarms, and then be part of the rescue effort alongside firefighters. Young Harry quickly confessed to setting the fire. He was accused of arson and probably would have gone to the state prison. But a progressive attorney named Thomas J. Walsh served as Harry's defense lawyer at no charge. Walsh knew Harry's father, a bartender at the Montana Club. Walsh convinced the judge to send Harry to the Pine Hills Youth Correctional Center in Miles City instead of to prison. Before this, anyone who committed a serious crime, no matter how young, could be sentenced to the Montana State Prison. The idea of treating children differently than adults was a progressive era idea. A few years later, lawmakers created a juvenile court system, guaranteeing that children who got in trouble with the law would no longer be treated the same as criminal adults. Prohibition, a reform that failed. One progressive era reform failed dismally. Prohibition was a movement to outlaw alcohol. Many progressives saw the damage that alcoholism wreaked on people, families, and society. They hoped that outlawing alcohol would make society better. In 1916, Montanans passed a prohibition referendum, making it illegal to drink, serve, or make alcoholic beverages. In 1919, prohibition became the law of the U.S. through the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But people did not stop drinking alcohol, they just drank it in secret. Bootleg illegal alcohol became a huge profitable business. Whiskey runners smuggled liquor into the U.S. from Canada. Farmers set up hidden distilleries to make alcohol. Across the country, bootleggers built an efficient transportation and communications network to funnel alcohol to the big cities. Some focused on the open country between the High Line and Canada, where it was easy to hide from the law. After a serious drought hit in 1917,
See Chapter 13.
Many families in farm towns, like Havre and Plentywood, helped transport liquor for the bootleggers because they paid in cash. Helping bootleggers was one way to earn money when the crops failed. Prohibition ended in failure. Instead of improving morals, it only encouraged people to break the law. The Montana legislature repealed its prohibition law in 1926, and Congress repealed the 18th Amendment in 1933. Even Montanans who disapproved of drinking were glad to see the law go. Getting radical. Most progressives believed in America's basic system of democracy and capitalism.
An economic system in which privately owned businesses carry on trade for profit.
But others demanded more radical change. They believed that capitalism itself created poverty and misery because it made a few people very rich and kept others very poor. Socialists, for a more equal distribution of wealth. Some Montanans became socialists, who were people who believed that major industries and services should be owned and regulated by the state. Socialists pushed for radical change. Some wanted to create a new economic system that gave power to the working class. The Socialist Party became popular after 1900. Socialist Party candidates ran for office in Butte, Anaconda, Red Lodge, and Livingston. Socialist Lewis J. Duncan ran for mayor of Butte in 1911. He won by a landslide. Duncan cleaned up city government and stopped corruption. He spoke out against the Anaconda Company and its unfair tactics against working citizens. Burton K. Wheeler, who was then the U.S. Attorney for Montana, called Duncan the best mayor Butte has ever had, as far as honesty was concerned. When Mayor Duncan was re-elected in 1914, the company decided to force him from office. Its newspapers published accusations against the socialists and warned that an armed band of socialists was about to attack Butte. Company officials urged Montana Governor Samuel Stewart to send armed militiamen to protect the city. The armed soldiers rode their horses up to the brand new Silverbow County Courthouse, dismissed all the city employees, and filed false charges against Mayor Duncan. 3 days later, a company-paid judge removed Mayor Duncan from office. The IWW and the free speech fight. In western Montana, loggers also labored under the control of big corporations. They put up with unhealthy working conditions,
see Chapter 12,
and unfair hiring practices. Lumber companies hired employment agencies to fill the constant need for laborers. These agencies charged workers large employment fees, which came out of the workers' first paycheck. Then the foreman often fired the workers, sometimes after a few days. Workers had to pay the fees again to get their jobs back. By 1909, the workers had had enough. Many of them joined with the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, also known as the Wobblies, a radical labor union with many socialist ideas. The union sent representatives into Montana to gain attention for the lumbermen's problems. Union members stood on platforms in downtown Missoula and gave public speeches against the unfair practices of the lumber companies. The mayor of Missoula tried to stop the speakers. He had them arrested under a city law against making street speeches and charged them with disturbing the peace. But this was exactly what the IWW activists had expected. Hundreds of IWW members from across the Pacific Northwest poured into Missoula by train. One by one they mounted the platform and began their speeches. Some of them simply read the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees freedom of expression. As soon as one was arrested, the next one stepped up. Within a few days, the police had arrested 43 people, including 2 women. The city could hardly pay for feeding them all. Trials and court costs would be even more expensive. Crowds thronged Missoula's main intersection each day to see what would happen next. When police arrested 19-year-old Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, citizens posted her $50 bond. The next day, Edith Frenette, an IWW worker from Spokane, was arrested before a crowd of 1,000 Missoulians. The crowd pelted the police officers with rocks as they escorted Frenette to jail. A few days later, the IWW organized a 600-person protest march through downtown Missoula. City leaders decided they could not stop the labor union from speaking out for workers' rights. The city dropped all charges, released the IWW members from jail, and told them they were free to give public speeches. The labor union had won the right to speak out against unfair labor practices. The Nonpartisan League. The Nonpartisan League was a passionate group of reform-minded farmers. The group was called nonpartisan because they did not support either of the 2 major political parties. These farmers also had some socialist ideas. They thought the railroads, bankers, and grain elevator operators made too much money from the farmers' labor. Some thought the state should run the banks, grain elevators, packing plants, and farmers' insurance programs. Some businessmen called them the wild men from the prairies because League members spoke out against big business. When drought and depression descended on the plains after 1917, the farmers' troubles grew seriously worse. More farmers joined the Nonpartisan League. They cried out against the railroad for its high freight rates and against the company because it paid very little in taxes compared to what the farmers had to pay.
See Chapter 10.
The Progressive Era in Indian Country. The progressive movement affected Montana Indians in 2 distinctly different ways. On the one hand, progressives campaigned to have Montana's reservations,
land that tribes had reserved for their own use through treaties,
cut up and sold off under allotment, which is the practice of subdividing Indian reservations into privately owned parcels. And on the other hand, progressives forced the U.S. government to create a new reservation. These 2 opposite actions, happening around the same time, show how complicated U.S. policy was toward Indian people. Allotments. Destroy native cultures to achieve progress. Congress had passed the Allotment Act, or Dawes Act, in 1887. This act permitted the government to divide up tribal lands into individual allotments, and then assign allotments to individual tribal members. The government often sold the remaining acreage to non-Indians for farms and grazing land. Many progressives believed that tribal societies were a thing of the past. They believed that breaking up tribes would help usher American Indians into the modern age. So progressives supported allotment because it helped destroy tribal lifeways. The allotment program did little to help American Indians to assimilate,
to be absorbed into majority society.
Instead, it snatched away any prosperity and success that Indian people had achieved on the reservations. And it removed from tribal ownership millions of acres of land, guaranteed them forever by treaty.
An agreement between governments. See chapters 11 and 13.
Montana progressive Joseph M. Dixon, a U.S. Senator, led the charge for allotments. Despite strong protests from the tribes, Dixon joined Missoula real estate developers to campaign aggressively for the Flathead Reservation to be allotted. Later, Dixon himself bought a ranch on the Flathead Reservation. 1916. Creating Rocky Boys Reservation. At the same time that federal policies sought to destroy Indian tribes and to open up reservations to white settlement, the government created a brand new reservation in Montana, Rocky Boys Indian Reservation, home to Montana's Chippewa and Cree people. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, two small bands of Chippewa and Cree lived in Montana. Rocky Boy, his real name was Stonechild, was leader of the Chippewa band. Little Bear led the Cree. These bands had relatives on reservations in the Dakotas and in Canada, but no longer had a land base of their own. For 20 years, they moved back and forth across Montana working seasonal jobs. Without a land base, and with no year-round home, the Cree and Chippewa people suffered terrible poverty. Many of them starved or died of simple illnesses. Each year their situation got worse. Since they were not a federally recognized tribe, the government did nothing to help. Church groups and women's organizations gave them food, clothing, and blankets. People in Helena, Havre, and Great Falls began to demand a reservation for the Chippewa Cree. In 1912, Stonechild asked the government for a bit of land for his people near the Bears Paw Mountains. He knew the government was closing an old military reserve called Fort Assiniboine. He fought an uphill battle against homesteaders, ranchers, and the townspeople of Havre, who wanted the Fort Assiniboine lands for farms and businesses. In his travels, Stonechild had made some influential friends: artist Charles M. Russell, writer and legislator Frank B. Linderman, prominent businessman and Great Falls founder Paris Gibson, and William Bull, publisher of the Great Falls Tribune. Together, these four men campaigned hard on behalf of the Chippewa and Cree people. Soon most Montanans supported the cause, too. Finally, the government assigned 55,040 acres on the southwest corner of the former Fort Assiniboine for the reservation. By the time President Woodrow Wilson signed the executive order creating the reservation in November 1916, Stonechild had died. The reservation was named Rocky Boys after him. Over time, the tribes were able to increase Rocky Boys Reservation to just more than 122,000 acres. Today, about 3,400 Chippewa Cree people live there. 1924. Indians become U.S. citizens. In 1924, progressives at the national level initiated yet another reform to U.S. Indian policy. They supported a federal law granting U.S. citizenship to American Indians. Before this act, American Indians could apply to become U.S. citizens several ways: by homesteading, by claiming private property under allotments, or by marrying U.S. citizens. They were not born U.S. citizens, but they were not aliens, people born in a foreign country, either. Many American Indians had fought honorably in World War I. National leaders thought their service proved Indians' commitment to the U.S. On June 2, 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, granting full U.S. citizenship to all American Indians born in the United States. Politicians assumed that American Indians wanted to become U.S. citizens. However, many American Indians saw the irony,
humor based on something absurd,
in the government granting them citizenship in a land that had been theirs for thousands of years. Racism, the ugly face of progressivism. By 1920, there were 550,000 people living in Montana. Nearly half of them were foreign-born or first-generation Americans. They came from Northern, Southern, and Eastern Europe, from Mexico, and from Asia. Usually they clustered in communities with others from their country. Butte, for example, had 62 different Chinese-owned businesses, including 4 doctors' offices, in 1914. Instead of embracing diversity, many progressives thought that native-born whites were more intelligent and civilized than the new immigrants. They thought the people who clung to ancient ideas and traditions got in the way of progressive change. They were particularly hostile toward Asians. Not all progressives adopted racist attitudes, but some did. In the 1890s, the Butte Miners Union called on residents to boycott,
refused to do business with,
all Chinese-owned and Japanese-owned businesses. The Unionists claimed that just by living and conducting business in Butte, Asians threatened the life and industry of the city. Chinese restaurant owner Hum Fei sued the union for nearly destroying his business. His lawsuit ended the boycott, but not the prejudice,
a preformed negative opinion,
against Asians. In 1909, the Montana legislature made it illegal for whites to marry Asians or blacks. The last years of progressivism. In 1917, the U.S. entered World War I. People forgot about issues like poverty and safety at home. The war also made any challenges to the government or to authority seem more dangerous. In most places in the United States, the progressive movement was over by about 1918. In Montana, the progressive movement lasted much longer, into the 1920s. In 1920, Joseph M. Dixon became governor. He worked in many ways to put government back into the hands of the people. He pushed through an old age pension
retirement pay
law, making Montana one of the first states to provide support for its seniors. One of the most important acts Dixon accomplished was to help change the tax code to make it more fair. When Montana became a state in 1889, mining interests made sure that the state constitution gave mines a special low tax rate. That meant that the farmers and small business owners paid most of the expenses of state government, while the mines, especially the company, controlled almost everything the state did. In 1922, the mining industry earned $20 million and paid $13,559 in state taxes, less than 1,000%. Dixon called for corporations to pay a little more. This infuriated the company. When Dixon ran for re-election in 1924, the company made sure he lost. However, in the same election that Dixon lost, voters approved Initiative 28. Initiative 28 created a tax of up to 1% on mines producing over $100,000 per year. The people used their new political tool, the initiative, to do something politicians had been unwilling or unable to do: make the Anaconda Copper Mining Company pay a greater share of taxes. Montana's progressive legacy. Even after Dixon's term, the progressive movement did not die. It just went underground. It emerged again in the 1970s, when Montanans wrote a new constitution, which is now recognized as one of the most progressive documents of 20th century America.
See Chapter 21.
The progressive era left a complicated legacy.
Something handed down from the past.
Prohibition failed outright. Allotments on the reservations benefited whites, but plunged many American Indians into poverty. The law that prohibited interracial
between races
marriage stayed on the books until 1953. Yet today, most Americans think that clean drinking water, a safe workplace, and access to unpolluted food are basic rights. Everyone thinks that 12-year-olds belong in school, and no one questions women's role in the political system, even though 100 years ago, women were not allowed to vote. These reforms did not come easily, but thanks to the progressives, we now take them for granted. History is full of storylines that are all tangled up together. No period of time is one simple story. Right in the middle of the progressive era, another powerful movement arose to silence people from speaking their minds. At the same time that progressives worked for free speech and a stronger voice in government, some Montanans went to prison just for expressing their opinions. Chapter 16 tells another side of this complex period in Montana history.
Expressions of the People. The Stories of Frank B. Linderman. It is the full moon in the time of falling leaves. A wolf howls on a ridge overlooking an Indian camp. In one lodge, an elder named War Eagle speaks to his grandchildren. "What I shall tell you now," he says, "happened when the world was young." He talks deep into the night, telling his grandchildren the stories of their people, the animals, and the land into which they were born. And so begins the book, Indian Wise Stories, Sparks from War Eagle's Lodge Fire by Frank B. Linderman. Frank Bird Linderman, 1869 to 1938, was 16 years old when he came to the Flathead Valley. There, he made friends with Salish, Kootenai, Blackfeet, Chippewa, and Cree Indians who traveled through the region. They told Linderman stories of their lives, beliefs, and history. Linderman went on to be a gold assayer, a person who determines the value or quality of gold. He also owned the Sheridan, Montana newspaper called the Sheridan Chinook. Later, he became a state legislator and assistant secretary of the state of Montana. While living in Helena, he helped the Chippewa Cree obtain Rocky Boys Indian Reservation. But through it all, Linderman remembered the stories he had heard. He devoted the second half of his life to writing about Montana's Indian cultures and people. In 1927, he earned an honorary doctorate at the University of Montana for his studies and writings, including 12 books about Indian traditions. Two of Linderman's most popular books are Indian Y Stories, 1915, and Indian Old Man Stories, 1920. In these two books, Linderman repeats the wisdom stories given to him by Indian friends, stories about a sparrowhawk who has a conscience, and about how the fox makes the bison laugh. The stories tell why children's teeth come out, why elders lose their eyesight, and why skunks have stripes. The stories show humor and reverence for life, reflecting the beliefs of the people who carried them. Later, Linderman wrote Plenty Coups, Chief of the Crows, 1930, and Pretty Shield, A Crow Medicine Woman, 1932. These books are intimate biographies of two highly respected Crow, told through their own memories. Linderman always asked his friends to speak through Indian Sign Language, even when an interpreter was present. The Crow called Linderman Sign Talker because he had learned sign language so well. While many progressives thought Indians should leave their traditions behind, Linderman celebrated Indian traditions as an important part of Montana's cultural heritage.